You're listening to The Right Time, a story written and read by Philip Ballerscheff. If you'd like to read more of these stories, you can find a link to those in the description of this video. And as always, remember to like, share, and subscribe. From early childhood onward, he had gained an appreciation for the work that it took to maintain the world, whether that be the people repairing the streets he used, or the administration involved in arranging the grunt work, from managers to secretaries. It was a small miracle, really, and everyone responsible was a miracle worker. He was on one of his kicks, one of many, and they'd lately increased in frequency, every 6 months instead of every year. He was curious, not bookish, intelligent, not educated. He had a fine mind to work with, to use against his problems and the world at large, life as it came to him. What he lacked was material, raw information. His new turn had begun when his family, for lack of a better idea of what to do on the weekend, had visited their small local museum. He'd gone in indifferent and gone out happy. What a wonderful thing it was! As many props and placards and exhibits as the museum used to put its research on display, it couldn't do more than give an introduction to its subject, which in this case was local history. One wing was dedicated to the early settlers, how they found the land, what they did with it, and where they scouted for food and water. They brought pigs with them and let them determine what was edible and what wasn't. This process was imprecise. Humans and pigs are too different to share meals, at least at the same time. It did have its uses. What killed a pig was no good for people. Conversely, if a pig could live on something, so could a person, at least second-hand by fattening the pig up for slaughter at a later date. These and other tactics and the land the settlers applied them to were part of a short dip into ecology, a field so new to him that Lucas didn't know its name or understand that it could be studied on its own without consulting the other sciences. His pace when going from exhibit to exhibit was a continuous stop and start. He wandered and his parents never worried. They trusted him to be safe. The distance between them stretched and fell back. When one of them, usually Lucas, went eagerly ahead to the next room, the other caught up before they got too far apart to find each other again. He walked just under a run, keeping doggedly to the right, as most people did by sheer instinct. That was where the others were. That was where they went. This made 2 lanes of foot traffic, with no barrier between them but rules. The timid moved around the rule breakers. The bald got them back into line and made them walk with the rest. When history moved slowly, a century could pass, and the people born at its beginning would live like those who were born at its end. Not much remained of those lives. Their wooden houses had rotted and returned to the earth. Their metal tools, kept safe underground from every element but air, were as historical as the rust that covered them. The museum supplemented this sparse display of concrete evidence with paintings from the era. With the artifacts, you looked at the past clearly from where you stood in the present. With the paintings, you saw it more closely and through someone else's eyes. Lucas saw how the settlers had cleared forests so tall that, had they really existed, they would have buckled under their own weight, or else dried up under a sun that could never shine half as bright in real life as it did on canvas. They diverted enormous streams, whose water they used for dams, and whose fish they caught in nets and dragged to land. The settlement became a town, growing in size and in political complexity, from a direct democracy, governed only by the laws its mayor laid down, to part of a larger whole, though the means by which they lived, what they took from the land, were about the same. As Lucas came closer and closer to the present, there were no more than 10 years to an exhibit, and often there were less. History began to move faster. The time between milestones was measured in decades. Paintings gradually gave way to photographs taken at the events in question. This included the grand openings of stores, at whose doors the proud owners stood smiling, yearly parades, both official and amateur, and the inauguration of new mayors. Each picture had a plaque describing what it showed, regardless if it was redundant, so that everyone, including the visually impaired, could understand. There was a grainy photo of a parade whose banners proclaimed what they were honoring in bold all-capital letters. Below that stood Sanitation Workers Parade, 1902. He studied the photos as he had learned to study paintings in school, carefully drawing out each detail and not letting them be subsumed by the whole image. He discovered the range of emotions that one moment held, from the elation of the banner holders to the feigned cheeriness of those marching behind them. Their emotions and their movement both carried more by those around them than any inner momentum they might have. He studied the crowds of the mayoral inaugurations too. They were as happy as the parade goers. The occasion, however, was less self-explanatory, and so the museum had handily prepared a paragraph on the political tides that had swept these candidates in and out of office. Mayor George Tabor had been caught embezzling funds, 50,000 if his testimony was to be believed. He had more stashed away that the courts overlooked. Logically, too logically for the public, candidate John Hines promised an anti-corruption campaign. Straight and to the point. There was corruption, and that shouldn't be. Put him into office, and he'd clean it up. Tabor responded by playing the lovable rogue, one who shared his loot with the people. Was it fair to throw him out now that he'd been caught? He had taken a cut of the taxes he raised for himself, and yet, on the whole, people were better off because he made sure that he alone stole. The public saw him stand up to his rival thieves and applauded him for jailing them, as they would have done in his place. So enthusiastic were his supporters that they pooled together the money needed to pay his bail, allowing Tabor to go campaigning across the country for his re-election. He was rumored to have cried, "I knew you'd come through," and then hugged the men that had come to see him go free, giving each man his dollar's worth in the force of his embrace. His supporters more than recouped their investment, both in the form of the benefits he made available to all his citizens and also in the kickbacks he gave to them specifically out of his own pocket. Each year offered more material than the last in the form of newspapers, magazines, and flyers, the debris that people had made rare and therefore valuable for historians by throwing it away. The museum filled out their archive with what they bought from enthusiasts, who had preserved their collections for years and then sold them, when they lost interest, for far more than they had been worth in their day. None of them could have known that would happen. They had gone into it as a hobby, pure-hearted, and with no motive but a love for oddities. It was a long shot, a wild guess, to keep a newspaper clipping, because it might one day, years from now, prove to be a first-hand document of something monumental. That, Lucas assumed, was why the museum stopped 20 years short of the present day. It was a rule they had to define what was already history and what was, for now, the recent past. The day Lucas spent at the museum showed him how much he had to learn. Realizing this made him a little ashamed and also ready to remedy that, however long it might take. Many events that had shaken the world were foreign to him. I use the phrase shook the world relatively, of course, as everyone does, whether they know it or not, and if they don't, then it's their loss and their fault. Very little actually affects the whole world. The first two world wars, which Lucas was, I should add, familiar with, could have been ignored even as they were being waged by going to a remote part of Africa, far from Ethiopia, or anywhere else the great armies of the day were trying their luck. The history of Africa, ironically, the history of Africa, really history as a whole, outside of that of his town and his country, was something about which he was more or less clueless. His school was teaching him as much as it could in the hours it was given, and tried to do more. And then there were all the fields of study I haven't mentioned and won't go into. What good would it do us? There was more that Lucas didn't know than he did, which is true of everyone, so why point it out more than we have to? A glance at history showed he wasn't the only one guilty of ignorance, which put the matter into perspective. Some Indians, by no means all, but then there are any makes it unusual, regularly hail both Hitler and Stalin as heroes. Hitler because he fought the British Empire, and Stalin because of the open relationship he maintained with Indian diplomats and the grain he sent to alleviate the Bengali famine. And then there were his classmates. Plugging these gaps was only one of the things he had set himself to, and was no longer at the forefront of his mind. Much was going on around him, in his friends' families, not in his own. His mother had heard, in church, she said, that some boy, Owen, was feeling left out. Wouldn't it be nice to go play with him? She asked. Lucas pulled his bottom lip into his mouth, then bit down on it. Like swinging his arms as he walked, it felt right, and he couldn't keep it up forever. It was an expression of a feeling so powerful that it turned physical. She mangled a Sunday school sounding line about caring for the downtrodden, invoking it as an idea that should have power over him. She saw, and how could she have overlooked it, that he listened attentively in church, but misjudged what awoke his interest. Properly phrased, undisguised, she meant, "Don't you want to be nice?" "What's wrong with him?" Lucas asked. If she was going to make him do this, he should at least know why. He was lonely, he needed someone. Why him? Who else? There must be somebody, he said, astonished. People took to Lucas so well that he couldn't see that there were boys of whom this wasn't true. She had it in reverse, he thought. By telling him what was wrong, she was trying to get him to help. He had a tender heart for his friends, though he would hate to hear it put like that. For a stranger, he felt nothing, and Owen was a stranger, although Lucas knew his name. She must have known that all this would backfire. There was no way she couldn't have, and no way he could do as she expected, not under the conditions she set out. Friendship couldn't be forced, still she persisted. He groaned violently, and then sighed at the responsibility she had saddled him with, from which he saw no escape. The smartest move was to agree with her now, and treat her plea as a suggestion she might soon forget. On Sunday she was in high spirits, and had time to give him marching orders. Next Friday should have been a different story. It wasn't. She hadn't forgotten by then, and was more insistent than before. He'd have to do as she was told, and right away, too. So he'd get the benefit of her good graces. Go willingly and be praised for it, or resist and be punished. The outcome, wasting his time, was the same. He went to his room to delay the inevitable. His mother had no religious feeling. Her friends did. A little on most days, and a lot when something was out of their hands and they could think of nothing to do but pray. Emergencies, disasters, twists of fate that hurt them inside, so much so that they fell to their knees. Beth especially could get into these moods, like somebody who let themselves be hypnotized, and like somebody who let themselves be hypnotized was a bit ashamed after the fact. Oh, I was so scared. I was so scared I just started praying. I didn't know what to do, Beth liked to confess. Her helplessness in these situations was real, though exaggerated for attention. Her prayer amounted to self-pity and a sense of theatricality. This was what his mother thought of her, not that they disliked each other. Quite the opposite. His mother understood how Beth worked, who she was as a person, just as she understood her other friends and their flaws. Years ago, before he knew better, Lucas asked her why she went to church if she didn't believe. It was good to meet people, she said, and good for his character. It was a social club, really. He realized that much later, while looking around the church during a service. He distinguished the adults from himself by their height. Sitting down in the pews, Lucas could see only those taller than himself. He didn't have much height to look down from, though he was old enough that his feet touched the floor. Attempting to swing them back and forth was awkward, not least because of his age, and difficult too, since the hinges in his knees that the motion depended on were too close to his seat to move freely. Boredom turned his attention to the strangest things. You could see the wood grain in the pews, and also in the pulpit if you stared at it intently. Their pastor was so lenient that Lucas wondered at times what held his faith together. He understood, and to a certain extent appreciated, though he'd never attended those services, how a church founded on stern doctrine survived for centuries. Their pastor was old, which came with the job and what it required, a theology degree and building a name for yourself with a congregation, both of which took years to happen. He wore a white robe, and for his neck a red shawl, which he draped around his shoulders and so gave it the height it needed to hang comfortably from his body, as his robe did. As for his glasses, he balanced them on the fat end of his nose, where they hung precariously without ever actually falling off. His clothes, his age, his views, and lastly his voice, which he tended not to strain much because his sermons had no need for volume, made him kindly. Most of what he said passed Lucas by. One sermon had stayed. Lucas knew how it had begun. Wasn't God, the pastor said, a sort of scientist? Their church had no tradition of call and response sermons. There was no chorus of "that's right" or to pick up on. He understood how well his idea was received by the fact that nobody made a fuss or left. They waited to see how he'd develop this seemingly stray thought into half an hour's worth of preaching. It was less than miraculous, and yet impressive nonetheless, to those still awake and able to give the man his due. The memory warped. In the coming days, Lucas found that he could summon up those words any time he wanted to. The memory warped like a record overplayed. The more time passed between him and that day, the less certain he was about what had happened. He interrogated himself about the most minor of details, and remembered little except that one line. What had their pastor been wearing? What about his mother? What about himself? That had fallen by the wayside and couldn't be picked up again. He wondered, too, why it should be that he remembered this particular sermon over those more daring or more uplifting. The pastor went on to clarify his statement. Evolution, like everything else, was one of God's experiments. His point was that science investigated what was, while religion, he said, attempted to explain why. He elaborated, giving them the history of Clarence Darrow and the Scopes trial, beginning by saying, back in 1925, people saw things quite differently, and finished by congratulating his audience on how far they, as a faith, had come since then. The end of the trial was where he decided to end his sermon. Lucas took it more seriously than his mother did, more seriously perhaps than half the congregation, of whom few were regulars. Every Easter the pastor joked that church attendance was like the tides. Sometimes you knew they'd come in, sometimes they surprised you. Jeans became dress pants for the men and boys, and for the women and girls, dresses without the pants. The slovenly were presentable. The presentable made attempts at elegance. Everyone went up a step on the proverbial scale, everyone but him. He didn't need to dress up for the occasion, not any more than he always did. His congregation found it, if not exactly funny, then worth a smile to hear their behavior described. The joke was true at Christmas, too, but had no place in his sermon, so he moved it up to Easter and talked about both days, though one was out of season. Those were the services he depended on. The rest you'd guess at, hope for, plead with, and curse if they didn't go your way. Christmas was a bigger pull than Easter, presumably because in spring you could find yourself entranced by the weather on your way to church and decide to blow it off. In winter, once you'd bundled up and braved icy streets, you were happy to go inside, whether it was your home or not. Those who caught cold at that time of year, or at any other, could expect to hear him say, "God bless you," in earnest, and also in jest in the same 3 words. As congregants cottoned on and listened for sneezes, repeating the joke gleefully as if it were their own. These flippant remarks hid how the pastor expected his words to be taken. He put his whole week into his sermon, from Sunday afternoon right after the service when he'd stroll the church grounds to get his blood pumping and his brain working, listening to the bells ring the service to a close, to Saturday night, when he'd rehearse what he'd written in the days past, and then refine so it sounded natural. He kept a pad of paper no bigger than the palm of his hand on him at all times, so that when inspiration struck, he'd catch it. This solved one problem and created another, that of the hassle of transferring quickly written notes onto something he could work on at his desk. Though he wrote and edited his sermons bit by bit, he did so with one whole document. It was no good carrying armfuls of notes around and trying to keep them in order. He'd lose his head and lose sight of what he wanted to say. His subjects were never contentious. He spoke of love and forgiveness and rarely about religion as a factor in cultivating those virtues. Nor was he often explicit about who had called them to love one another and why. Lucas had at one point felt distaste for their pastor's limp-wristed concessions. They were Lutherans, so said his mother, and the name of the church agreed with her. The difference between himself and a Catholic was made a little clearer to him when his family happened to come across a Catholic church, and Lucas sought an explanation for why it was more ornate and had a longer, more complicated name than what he was used to. It wasn't large at all, about as big as their own church. White stone, red brick. No, white stone, not red brick. The windows were clear glass and appeared dark blue because there was no light inside. Because there was no light inside the church that could reach them. His mother wished for a week afterwards that they would meet a Catholic family so that Lucas might befriend one of the many children that they were bound by chance and by faith to have. This was not to be, and in time she'd find that out. People filed through the door as they left. A service was starting. Her immediate wish was to stay and watch. She didn't dare receive communion or participate in any other sense. Lucas would have stayed too if the Catholics cleared out, and they let him admire the church unobserved. A man of firm convictions was one Lucas could respect. By the time he was back in his own church the following Sunday, he still didn't know what exactly Catholics believed in. He hadn't heard one preach, nor had he read their pamphlets side by side with their Lutheran material to know the difference. Their beliefs were really beside the point. What concerned Lucas was how fast they held to them. Did he want to listen to a fire and brimstone type? He felt he did. He could take a sermon every Sunday. He'd never fall asleep again. More importantly, did he want to live under parents who would listen to that kind of a sermon? No, and coming to this conclusion made him cautious of too strongly embracing his fleeting wishes. He disassembled this idea like a clock, and just like a clock, he couldn't make it work again, couldn't fit the gears together and get it to go. It lay strewn about the floor in front of him, invisible to everyone else. He looked at it and appeared to be deep in thought, which he was, and praying, which he wasn't. His hands were in his lap, not pressed together for any purpose, spiritual or practical. His former passion for a different preacher was lost on him. Lucas had befriended the one Jewish boy in his school, Aaron Kaplan, not at his mother's behest, but because they were actually able to get along well. The boy told his parents about Lucas, and they invited Lucas's family over. How nice, his parents said. Of course they would come. They brought kosher wine as a gift, which Mr. Kaplan accepted graciously. Oh, you shouldn't have, he said, taking the bottle in hand. Well, he'd have to drink it anyway, his parents replied. Between him and his wife, they downed half a bottle easily, and his guests would help if they needed to. No, really, you shouldn't have. We're not very religious, Mr. Kaplan clarified, dropping the act of refusing their gift. Well, it was good of them, nevertheless, to be mindful of others. He raised the bottle in a toast, uncorked it, asked his wife to get glasses, and toasted again when everyone had their drinks. Lucas's father gave him his glass. Try it, he said. Lucas took a sip. Just try it. Don't drink at all, his father said. Lucas, unsure of what was too much, drank a little less than his father would have allowed. Aaron looked to his father, who looked at his wife. They debated what to do. He's too young, Mr. Kaplan said. Or the adults debated what to do. He's too young, Mr. Kaplan said. It's all right if they do it, not for us. Why not? Let him have a taste. There's no harm in that, his wife argued. You saw what Lucas had. Barely a mouthful, and their mouths aren't big to begin with. Her husband relented. He gave Aaron his glass. As Aaron took a swig, a drop of wine dribbled down his chin. He wiped it away before it fell on his shirt. Before it fell on his shirt. Mr. Kaplan saw this scene and felt a pang of regret, but having second thoughts wouldn't take back what he'd done. His wife had been the one to change his mind, so he placed the blame squarely on her shoulders. She, meanwhile, had no thoughts about assigning guilt, and was entertaining their guests with conversation. They ate dinner in good spirits. Not wanting to be rude, and at the same time burning for answers, Lucas began timidly putting questions about religion to the Kaplans, only the parents. They were figures of authority, distant though they were from his own family. The Kaplan's school, the Kaplan schooling had been overwhelmingly secular, like Lucas's own. Both had half-heartedly reformed parents, and so what they gave to their son was a fraction of what they'd received in their own childhoods. They told Lucas some of what they knew, and when their answers gave rise to more questions, the reason behind the rituals, they began to turn things around on him, testing him, inadvertently, on how well he knew the Old Testament. Aaron joined in, and Lucas relaxed, treating it as trivia and not as an uncomfortable intrusion into the Kaplan's non-existent religious life. That was what his mother hoped for him and Owen. He could stall no longer. He found his mother in her room and announced that he'd visit Owen today. The date was set. Lucas told his father he was off to see Owen because he hasn't got anyone. This received less of a send-off than he'd hoped for. A brief nod and an admonition to be good, which Lucas said he would be. His ears were shrewd and heard a reminder and a reproof for wrongdoing not yet done. And heard in his father's words a reminder and a reproof for wrongdoing not yet done. His father tried to cram a book into every weekend he had, a daunting task for someone as slow a reader as him. He approached reading and church as part of maintaining his character. He let the words of their preacher and his authors pour over him so quickly that they left no lasting impression. He relied on bestseller lists and prizes to find his next book. They acted as guides for readers like him, who hadn't the patience or the budget to sort through the many books that made it to market. His father felt his life was coming to a standstill, and this was how he meant to fight it. By introducing some movement, some life, some new ideas into their home. You lost momentum, he mused, the more you stuck to a routine, and the more you tried to get out of it, whether that was your career, your home life, or something else. He was unsure which applied to him and unsure how to fix it. He grafted the course of his life and the realizations he made about it onto the lives of others, regardless of how well they fit together. If he had to force it, so be it. Compared to his son, he had only their childhoods. Lucas's childhood wasn't over, and his own was decades past. Thinking back great distances was hard to do with any accuracy. Some could remember days of their lives clearly. He couldn't, and was for a minute jealous, then resolved the feeling by realizing that it was no use to be that way. A waste of time and energy. How easy he had it. He could change his mind with a sentence, something he bet himself others couldn't do. Lucas was shaping up to be about as good a boy as he'd been then. Different, uh, as his father had been then. Different, no doubt, as everyone is, because of their character and their circumstances, and also about as good. And his wife? She was getting on with her career, as he was too. Here another problem arose. How could you compare them? By position? Not all jobs had a strict hierarchy. By salary? He was paid by commission, his wife every month. Some months were good for him, some bad, and as for her, each month was the same in regards to the money she made, barring a promotion or a pay raise. His eyes took on an unsparing intensity as these thoughts swirled in his head, the same look he'd had while reading. His hands held his book, his eyes stared at its pages, but his mind was elsewhere. There was a commotion inside of him, so much that it was hard to keep still. In moments of uncertainty about his future, he looked back at his past and asked where he had gone wrong. He had lost count of how many times he had done that, and so he observed this episode of his with calm detachment while feeling something quite different. He sank deeper and deeper into his chair the longer he sat in it. Though it wasn't a rocking chair, he swayed in it anyway, very slightly. The motion he made was all his. He knew, or thought he knew, about his wife's hopes for Lucas and Owen. Really, he couldn't know. He had his suspicions, which were by blind chance correct. It was just the sort of thing she'd put Lucas up to. She felt sorry for Owen and needed Lucas to make it better. It was nonsense to deputize him as a social worker when he was just a boy. No, she wasn't so selfish. She probably did think Lucas could help and reach Owen more easily than she could. His father kept quiet about this, and about everything else on his mind. He went on with his reading. He had worked hard for 5 days straight, at the office and at home, and so he slowly carved out a free weekend for himself. Now he was going to put it to use. Lucas, having arrived at Owen's house, took a deep breath and went on with what he had to do. He saw him by the window and waved, thereby avoiding the painful scene that knocking and explaining to Owen's parents why he was there would have caused. Owen got up from the window sill, and in 30 seconds he was standing in front of him. Had Owen, Lucas thought, told his parents where he was going? His eyes swept the length of Owen's house. To get from his room to the front door should take Owen less than it had, assuming he hadn't dawdled, so what had he done with the leftover seconds? These directionless questions whipped Lucas up into a state of unease that thankfully went unnoticed by everyone but himself. I heard you weren't doing well and thought you might need someone, Lucas said. He quoted his mother verbatim, There was no chance of being misunderstood. Owen stared at him with his big eyes, and as the sun shined into them, it made Owen look lively. That was only a trick of the light. His energy and appearance were at odds with one another. The clouds were thick, white, and tinted blue. All week Lucas had awoken to a clear sky in his window, unmarred by the clouds that were waiting just out of sight. This day would have been perfect, like those before it, if not for what Lucas had to do with it. He was being dramatic. He had a right to be, not that it would do him any good. He got himself under control again. What could two boys do? Nothing much. No games worth playing. Their town had plenty of baseball diamonds, a stadium for professionals, and smaller sandlots open to the public, which the kids used. He had a baseball and a bat and had friends to fill out a team, but he wouldn't want Owen to be a part of it. And who knew if Owen would want that? Most boys he knew did, and that was because he played with them. They found each other naturally because of their shared interests. There was no need for introductions like the one he had just made. They tried to pass the time in conversation. Lucas took the lead because he wanted to do his duty and to be able to tell his mother he did as he was told. She couldn't make him a liar if he wasn't one. His impression of Owen was of a shy, withdrawn boy who would rather not have anyone take pity on him, especially not someone his age. Lucas sized him up further. Owen wasn't much to look at, but as hard as Lucas tried, he couldn't describe him. He wasn't especially one thing or another, stocky or skinny, tall or short. He was lukewarm in all aspects. Lucas told him about the museum and his newfound humbleness, and that, while he hadn't ever thought he was smart before, he understood a bit better how far he had to go. It was arrogant to say you knew everything, and also to claim to know the depths of your own ignorance, because once you had mapped out the perimeter of your knowledge, you could then go about filling the rest in. However long that'd take you, you could do it. Lucas showed how much he had improved by throwing names around as soon as they entered his mind, talking until the warehouses of his memory were nearing exhaustion. And Owen was visibly overwhelmed. Did Owen know George Tabor, John Hines, the mayors that preceded them and those that followed? Their policies, their personalities, the rumors that had spread, some squashed, some encouraged, which had made them larger than life? No, he didn't. I never felt as stupid as I did that day in the museum, Lucas said. I get the same feeling from talking to you, Owen admitted ruefully. Hearing this shamed Lucas into silence. Suddenly embarrassed at how he had gone on, he gave a short laugh. Though the joke was partly at his expense, he preferred this newly animated Owen to the silent companion he'd been just a minute ago. They passed a sandlot. The kids kicked up clouds of dust as they played, and for the moment that Lucas allowed himself to look, he wanted to join them and abandon Owen. No, that would be cruel. He'd made it this far, he'd stick it out to the end. As Lucas turned back to the game, he saw that Owen was also interested. They watched from behind the chain-link fence and saw enough of the game to talk about it. The players, who often slid into bases, had streaks of dirt running from or below their thighs up to the seat of their pants. Most details escaped them. It was hard to see through the fence and hard to hear over the crowd. Owen concentrated on what he could make out, squinting his eyes and pricking his ears, then smiled as the solution revealed itself to him. The reaction from the stands spelled out what had happened in the broadest possible terms. The crack of a bat and a great cheer meant somebody had scored. The same crack, followed by a tense waiting period and then a cheer, might mean that a player had caught a ball in midair, or that the batter had knocked it not quite out of the park, giving his teammates a chance to round the bases. That, in conjunction with what they could see, told them most of what they needed to know. Once Owen worked out the answer, Lucas saw him come alive, and not just for one momentary remark either. For 5 whole minutes, he talked about how he could tell what was going on with his eyes shut. His system, he called it. Lucas was too caught up in the mood to challenge him on this. Did he play? If there was a spot for him, Owen said, he liked to watch. Never mind. What teams did he like? He supposed he liked their home team, the ones in blue and white. He and his dad watched them sometimes. You got the colors right and you don't know their name? Lucas asked incredulously. He had overestimated him, somehow. Lucas started bringing him up to speed on which teams were good, which bad, and which were toss-ups every season. He talked so rapidly that his words ran together. When he told Owen they should head back home, Owen thought for a second what that had to do with baseball. Owen took him by the arm and spun him around. This way, he commanded, then continued his lecture. Owen looked to the sandlot as they passed by it again. The game was over. Had they been walking for that long? Well, then he understood why Lucas wanted to go home. Lucas walked Owen to his house. Thanks, Owen said. I guess I have a lot to learn. Baseball and everything else, too. Lucas nodded. He had done his part. If he had been a good friend, Owen would want to see him again, and come by sometime. If not, he'd gotten his mother off his back. That was The Right Time, written and read by Philip Ballerscheff. Again, if you'd like to read along to these stories as I read them, or just read them as text, then you can find a link to my blog in the description of this video. And as always, remember to like, share, and subscribe. Thanks, and until next time.